I came home from a week on deployment thinking about nothing more than a hot shower, a cold beer, and maybe 10 straight hours of sleep. Yeah, that fantasy lasted about 30 seconds, because the moment my headlights hit the front of my property, something felt off. See, I live at the end of a narrow private access road, the kind of place you don't just stumble onto, you have to know it's there. My house sits tucked behind another property, and the only way in or out is a legally recorded easement that cuts right through the front lot. It's been that way since 2009, long before I ever bought the place, and it's not optional. It's permanent, written, filed, stamped, and boring enough that nobody ever questions it. Until someone with too much money decides. They're the exception. That someone was my new neighbor, except neighbor feels generous. More like a guy who bought the front property and immediately decided the world should rearrange itself around his blueprint. His name was Victor Hale, mid-40s, real estate developer, the kind of guy who shakes your hand while already calculating how to move your house 3 feet to the left for better resale value. His wife, Lila, barely spoke, just kind of observed everything like she was watching a show she didn't fully approve of. The first time we met, it was polite, surface-level stuff. He asked about the land, the layout, then casually, too casually, he goes, "Ever thought about rerouting your driveway?" And I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like one of those questions people ask when they don't understand how reality works. I told him, "It's not my driveway to reroute. It's an easement. It's locked in legally." He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that says, "Got it." It was the kind that says, "We'll see." That should have been my first warning. Construction started about 2 months later, and when I say construction, I mean a full-blown transformation, cranes, steel beams, trucks rolling in at sunrise, concrete mixers churning like they were building a damn airport instead of a house. And to be fair, I didn't complain. I figured, hey, it's temporary, everyone's got to build at some point. But there was this underlying feeling that none of it was being done around the existing layout. It was being done like the existing layout didn't matter. And then, I got called away for a week. Nothing dramatic, just routine orders. I locked up, left, didn't think twice about it. But when I came back, Sunday night, around 9 p.m., the road was gone. Not blocked, not damaged, gone. In its place was this pristine, freshly poured concrete courtyard, smooth, flawless, still pale from curing, stretching out like the entrance to some luxury resort, lined with decorative stone planters, subtle ground lighting, the kind of setup you'd see in a magazine spread titled Modern Minimalist Dream Home. And right in the middle of it, where my access road used to be, was solid, reinforced concrete, at least 6 inches thick. I just sat there in my truck, engine running, staring at it, like maybe if I blinked hard enough, it would snap back to reality. But no, it was real, and it was deliberate. That's when Victor stepped out. He walked toward me slow, relaxed, hands in his pockets like we were about to discuss the weather, and I rolled down the window, already knowing this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. "Oh hey," he says, like he just bumped into me at a grocery store. "Yeah, we redesigned the front approach, figured it would boost the property value." I looked at him for a second, trying to process whether he was actually serious. Then I said, "You buried my driveway." He shrugged, actually shrugged. "Well, you could probably put in another one from the side street, right?" That's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't oversight. This was a decision. He didn't just ignore the easement. He dismissed it, like it was a suggestion instead of a legal boundary. I reminded him, calmly, "That's a recorded easement. You can't just erase it." And he goes, "This is the part I'll never forget," he says, "Then I guess you'll have to take that up with someone." And just like that, he turned around and walked back inside his half-finished mansion, leaving me sitting there with no way to reach my own home. No apology, no negotiation, no hesitation, just pure entitlement wrapped in expensive concrete. I didn't argue, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew arguing right there wouldn't fix anything. It would just give him the satisfaction of thinking this was a debate. So I reversed, drove back out, and checked into a hotel. And that night, lying there staring at the ceiling, something shifted in my head. Because up until that moment, I thought this was just a bad neighbor situation. Annoying, maybe even disrespectful. But no, this was someone testing how far they could push, and expecting me to fold. And the funny thing about people like Victor? They're used to winning. Not because they're always right, but because most people don't push back hard enough to make it inconvenient. And I don't mind inconvenience. Not when it's earned. The next morning, I opened my closing documents, dug out the original easement paperwork, and started reading every line like it was a contract for my life. Because in a way, it was. And what I found was the beginning of a very expensive mistake for him. Now let me pause the story for a second, because this is where a lot of people get confused, and honestly, where guys like Victor think they're smarter than the system. According to standard procedure, an easement isn't just some informal agreement between neighbors. It's a legally binding property right that's attached to the land itself, not the person, meaning it survives sales, renovations, ego, all of it. You don't get to redesign around it like it's patio furniture. From a legal perspective, what Victor did wasn't just rude. It was a direct violation of recorded property rights, and that's the kind of thing courts don't treat lightly, because if you let one person ignore an easement, you basically undermine the entire structure of land ownership. And here's where it gets interesting. This is a psychological trap wealthy, control-driven personalities fall into all the time. They assume that because they can build, spend, and push, they must also have the authority to override anything in their way. It's not logic, it's pattern recognition from a life where resistance is rare. This is a psychological trap, because it blinds them to one simple truth. Laws don't care how confident you are. And Victor? He didn't just step into a gray area. He walked straight into a line that was already drawn in permanent ink. So the next morning, I didn't rush over there yelling, didn't bang on his door, didn't try to work it out like some kind of reasonable adult, because at that point, reasonable had already been poured over with 6 inches of concrete. Instead, I went quiet. And if you've ever dealt with someone like Victor, the kind of guy who thrives on control, you'll know silence bothers them way more than confrontation ever could, because silence means you're not playing their game anymore. I spread my documents out across the hotel desk, every page from my closing file, every map, every line of legal description, and there it was, clear as day. The easement, fixed location, defined boundaries, perpetual access. No ambiguity, no loopholes, no wiggle room. I drove straight to the county recorder's office, got certified copies, because if you're going to ruin someone's week, you better have paperwork that hits like a hammer. Then I called in a surveyor. Not the cheap kind, not the close enough guy. I hired someone who knew exactly how to translate legal descriptions into physical reality. And within 48 hours, he was out there with bright orange stakes, marking the exact easement line, right through the middle of Victor's brand new luxury courtyard. I watched from a distance as those stakes went in, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned, cutting across his polished concrete like a scar that hadn't been there the day before. And for the first time, I saw hesitation. Victor came outside, hands on his hips, staring at the markers like they were some kind of glitch in his design. "What is this?" he asked. I didn't raise my voice, didn't step closer. I just said, "That's the part you built over." He laughed, actually laughed, like this was still some kind of misunderstanding. "You're being dramatic," he said. "We can figure something out." And that right there, that shift from dismissive to let's talk, told me everything I needed to know. He realized, just not enough. So I took the next step. I called a real estate attorney. Her name was Dana Mercer, mid-50s, sharp, no patience for nonsense, the kind of person who doesn't waste words because she doesn't need to. And after I explained the situation, there was this brief pause on the line. Then she said, very calmly, "Yeah, this is bad for them." No hesitation, no maybe, no let's see. Just quiet certainty. Within that same week, she filed for an emergency injunction. And here's the thing about injunctions. They're not handed out casually. Courts don't like stepping into ongoing construction unless something is clearly wrong. So when the judge approved it in 3 days, that wasn't luck. That was the legal system saying, you shouldn't have done that. Construction stopped immediately. No more trucks, no more workers, no more progress. Just a half-finished mansion sitting behind a courtyard that suddenly had a legal target painted across it. But that wasn't even the part that really hurt him. Because here's what Victor didn't know. And honestly, this is the part that still makes me shake my head a little. The main underground electrical line feeding his property ran directly beneath that easement. Now, normally, that wouldn't matter much unless someone decides to pour reinforced concrete over it without authorization. Because easements aren't just about access. They're also about maintenance rights, meaning utility companies need clear, unobstructed access to those lines at all times. And by sealing that entire strip under solid concrete, Victor didn't just block my driveway. He interfered with the utility infrastructure. Once my attorney flagged that, the power company got involved, and unlike neighbors, utility companies don't negotiate feelings. They inspect, they assess, and they enforce. The verdict? No permanent electrical connection until the easement was fully restored to its original, unobstructed condition. Which meant one thing: everything he had just built across that strip. The courtyard, the planters, the lighting, the reinforced concrete base. All of it had to go. I remember the day demolition started, because it was quiet at first, almost respectful, like even the crew knew they were undoing something expensive. Then the machinery kicked in, and piece by piece, that flawless courtyard started breaking apart. Concrete cracked, stone shifted, dust filled the air, and underneath it all was the outline of what used to be my road. The cost? Over $70,000 just to tear it out. That's before legal fees, before damages, before restoring my access exactly as it was. And the real kicker? The mansion itself, finished, polished, ready, sat there for 8 months, completely dark. No electricity, no occupancy permit, no life inside it. Just this massive, beautiful structure, sitting in silence like a monument to a bad decision. And that silence? It does something to people. A few weeks into that waiting period, Victor's attitude changed again. The confidence was gone. The casual tone disappeared. Now it was negotiation. He approached me one afternoon while I was checking the survey markers. "Look," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "This has gotten out of hand. What if I just buy your property?" I almost smiled at that, not because it was tempting, but because it was predictable. When control fails, they try acquisition. I shook my head. Not interested. A few days later, he tried again. "Okay, what if I pay you to relocate the easement, properly this time?" There it was, the same idea from the beginning, just dressed up with money. I looked at him for a second, then said, "You had a chance to do it properly." And that was the end of that conversation. Because at this point, it wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about principle. Eventually, they had no choice. The entire courtyard was removed. The ground was regraded. And my access road was rebuilt exactly where it had always been. Same path, same function, same legal line that had been there long before Victor decided to redraw reality. And the day I drove back up that road for the first time since all of this started. No barriers, no concrete, just open access. I didn't speed, didn't celebrate, just drove, slowly, taking it in. Because sometimes winning doesn't feel loud. Sometimes it feels quiet. Like everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. So here's the part people always ask me about. Was it worth it? All the time, the stress, the back and forth, the legal process, the waiting, 8 months of inconvenience just to prove a point. And the answer is yeah, but not for the reason you think. Because this was never really about a driveway. It was about boundaries. The invisible kind. The ones people assume they can step over if they have enough confidence, enough money, or just enough audacity to act like the rules don't apply to them. And the truth is, most of the time, they're right. Most people avoid conflict. Most people don't want the hassle. Most people will look at a situation like this and think, is it really worth fighting over? And that's exactly what someone like Victor counts on. The lesson here is, when someone tests your boundaries, they're not just testing this situation, they're testing the pattern. They're asking, if I push here, do you move? And if the answer is yes, even once, they don't stop. Now let's talk about something people don't say out loud enough. Power doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks casual, polite, even friendly. It shows up as suggestions, as ideas, as small changes that seem reasonable on the surface. Have you considered moving your driveway? Sounds harmless, right? But underneath that question is an assumption that your reality is flexible and theirs is fixed. And if you don't catch that early, you end up negotiating something you were never supposed to negotiate in the first place. From a legal perspective, what protected me wasn't luck, and it wasn't aggression. It was documentation, boring, detailed, unexciting paperwork that most people barely glance at during closing. That stack of documents? That was the difference between inconvenience and losing access to my own home. So if there's one practical takeaway here, it's this. Know what you own. Know what rights come with it. And don't assume the other person respects them just because they exist, because clearly, that's not how this works. Now psychologically, this whole situation follows a pattern you'll see everywhere once you recognize it. Someone with resources and confidence makes a move that bends the rules, not breaks them outright, at least not obviously. Then they wait. They watch your reaction. If you hesitate, they push further. If you resist, they recalibrate. But if you hold firm, consistently, calmly, without emotional overreaction, something interesting happens. They run out of leverage. Because control only works when the other side participates. And I never gave him that. No shouting match. No dramatic confrontation. No moment where he could frame me as unreasonable. Just documentation, process, and consequences. And here's the part that might surprise you. I don't hate Victor. I don't even think he saw himself as the bad guy. In his mind, he was optimizing, improving, upgrading, doing what he'd probably done dozens of times before in other properties, other deals, other situations where no one pushed back hard enough to stop him. But this time, he ran into a line that didn't move. And that's the thing about lines like that. They don't need to shout. They don't need to argue. They just exist, quietly, firmly, until someone tries to cross them. Then suddenly, they matter a lot. So if you're watching this and wondering what you would have done in that situation, honestly, that's the real question, isn't it? Would you have fought it? Would you have taken the payout? Would you have just walked away and built another road to avoid the headache? There's no perfect answer, just consequences you're willing to live with. But I'll leave you with this. Some problems cost money to fix. Others cost something a little harder to measure, like whether people learn they can push you around. And once that lesson is taught, it's expensive to unteach. So yeah, for me, it was worth it. But I'm curious, what would you have done? Would you hold the line? Or take the deal? Let me know in the comments. And if you're into stories like this, the kind where things get a little messy but end exactly the way they're supposed to, go ahead and hit like, subscribe. You know the drill.